Yes, thank you so much for giving a great talk, Charles. So I have some questions. Some of them are more like a clarifications. Some of them are like things that I want to ask you about your opinions. So first question I had is the selection of these countries. So you picked 6 countries and regions like Israel, Korea, USA, China, Japan, and Taiwan. And there's no European countries. And then also there are 4 East Asian countries and regions. And it appears that these countries, 6 countries, were almost randomly chosen. And I'm curious about why you chose these particular regions and why you pick those rather than instead of choosing some of European countries that similarly affected by COVID-19. So that's what first question that I got. And the second one is that so you focused more on comparison across countries. And in terms of research design, I was wondering why you chose to compare across countries, because I thought that it is a bit difficult to compare countries in this case, because the concept of the civil rights, for example, may be different in different countries in begin with. And also the government actual measures and responses to COVID-19 different. Like in the Japanese case, for example, Japanese government actually didn't ban people's gathering, which is different from the US. So many government measures are mostly request basis rather than giving punishment and so on. So I think that these things make us a bit difficult to explain the variations across countries. I'm curious, why there are differences across countries. Is it because of the government measures, or trust levels are different among people, or maybe a Japanese or East Asians are more obedient to the government compared to people in Israel or the US? So I'm curious about what you think about differences across countries in your findings. And the third one is that so there is no much attention to the variations within countries about the effect of treatment. And you said that you found that the effect is more like a universe. But I'm curious about, I'm still curious about the differences across respondents, and maybe there are significant differences among people depending on their party support, for example, whether they are government supporters or opposition supporters. For instance, the treatment may not work as intended for the LDP supporters. In the context of Japan, for example, when legal scholars claim the unconstitutionality of government measures and government policies, those claims tend to be coming from left-leaning scholars oftentimes. So the treatment may have worked as a sort of party cue. So this may explain the backlash effect you found in Taiwan. I don't know if you found that I guess you didn't find any backlash effect in Japan, but maybe you found backlash effect among LDP supporters in the case of Japan, or more a right-leaning respondents. I don't know, but it might worth testing about these. And the next comment that I had came up to my mind is that your presentation reminded me of the debate about the Patriot Act signed into law and the Bush administration after September 11th in 2001. It's been almost 20 years ago, but it reminded me the case. And at that time, the government restricted the civil liberties under the Patriot Act. And there was a concern that the government's war on terrorism compromises civil liberties for safety concerns. So I'm curious if you think that your findings apply to like any other types of crises, like the case of war on terrorism, other than like a COVID-19. And the case of public health may be different from the case of national security, or maybe very similar. I don't know, but I'm curious about like applicability of your findings to other domains in the politics. And maybe there are some circumstances that the government can justify the restriction of civil rights more effectively, like in some areas or in some cases or at the particular point of the time. So I'm curious about like those like differences across issue types or time horizon and so on. And lastly, there are situations that the government has to restrict civil rights and liberties, such as national security and the COVID-19, of course. And Japan, for example, experienced nuclear accidents. In those cases, the government has to restrict civil rights and liberties. And what do you think about the effective messages that the government can deliver in those cases, and how should the government communicate with the citizens in a situation where the government has to constrain civil rights? You have any ideas about I know that the METI had a difficult time in telling people, communicating with people, the government need to avoid overly frightening the public, but at the same time, the government has to give them the right information. So I appreciate if you have any thought about those type of risk communications for the government and the bureaucrats. Okay, yeah, that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Ono. Charles, any reaction to his comments?
Yeah. So several ideas. So thanks so much, Ono-san, for putting a lot on the table to consider. A lot of really great questions, not only for the paper but for possible extinctions. So going in reverse order, how does the government communicate the need for rights restrictions, the need for dramatic radical policies to the public in a place like Japan, right? It's a fascinating question. One takeaway potentially from our paper is that it doesn't hurt the government to just explicitly acknowledge that these policies, short-term policies in most cases, are actually violating the Constitution. Right? Because we find that telling people about that doesn't seem to make a difference in Japan at all. So I think that being clear about that, not trying to hedge about it, but actually demonstrating that matters. In related work to this, we find that the more that you point out the possible health benefits of these policies, the more likely that people are to support them. Okay, so I think that clearly the government communicating the potential gains in terms of lives saved or how many lives might be impacted if the government doesn't take a certain policy that may seem to be radical or kind of violating people's rights in some way or another, I think is really useful. So I would admit to unconstitutionality in some ways, or admit to the possibility of unconstitutionality. But also stress that these policies or restrictions, whatever they are really, really necessary to save lives on the ground. And we find that Japanese respondents, in particular, among the 6 different countries, 6 different places we surveyed, that Japanese are really, really responsive to being told that to supporting policies that are more likely to save lives. So this seems to be something that's specific to the Japanese population. Your point about how public health might be different than, say, security threats, I think is broadly true. And security threats, I would actually imagine that if all these countries were facing a similar security threat and we had done the study, that we would have found even less care about the constitutionality of policies, right? People tend to underestimate the potential personal impacts of public health issues, but tend to overestimate in their mind the likelihood that they're going to be hit by a terrorist attack, right? The American public was, if you go back to the Patriot Act, much more supportive of broad, hugely sweeping policies that curtailed human freedom in order to prevent something like 9/11, where 3,000 people died from happening again. But now that we have 225,000 dead in America, and many of which would have been preventable deaths, the American public is shockingly resistant to supporting any kind of rights restrictions at all. And I think a lot of this has to go back to, if you do polls and you ask Americans how likely they think they are to be victims of a terrorist attack, those numbers are much higher than how likely they think they are to be victims of something like COVID-19, even when in reality, their likelihood of being victim to a terrorist attack is shockingly small compared to like contracting something like COVID-19. So a lot of this is public perceptions, right? The difference across respondents. So we did look to see whether people that voted for the incumbent government responded differently to our constitution treatment or not, much in the way that you suggested. We don't find any differences there. The reason you asked this question is the paper that we sent you didn't have that analysis yet. So I'm sorry for kind of springing that on you, but we don't find anything there. This idea that it's hard to make sense of the differences across countries is true. At the end of the day, it's in some ways a qualitative 6-case comparison, right? There are many things that are different across these countries. One thing that we took great care of is to make sure that the survey instruments were as similar as possible in terms of meaning. So we had everything double translated. And we have reason to believe that respondents correctly across countries read these policies to be potential violations of freedom in the same way, even if they hadn't been enacted yet, that these were kind of on the horizon, things the government was talking about. And finally, the question about country selection. So all of these are developed, economically successful countries or areas. All of them except for China are democracies, right? And these are kind of ad hoc rules. But the truth is that we did the study in the US. We were going to do it in Israel because Israel has a really strong constitution, and that would make an interesting comparison. And then opportunities came available through the Tokyo Foundation to field studies in Japan and across Asia. So in many ways, our sample selection was one of convenience. If we would have done it all over, we probably would have picked states that were in different regions of the world that faced different challenges when it came to COVID-19. So that's something we're still grappling with in the manuscript as to how to write everything up. But thank you so much, Ono-san, for your careful read of the paper and for your great feedback.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you, Professor Ono. And now move on to the Q&A, question and answer sessions. And
so the first question, questionnaire, the person who raised the question, I think has understood this entirely, which is that if people do not have a problem with the government violating the Constitution, then ultimately the Constitution really doesn't have any effect in regulating the government. And that should be, I think, alarming to many of us who are paying attention to broader geopolitical trends, because you see governments throughout the West, throughout Asia, going out of their way almost to violate and to trample upon the human rights of their citizens. This is a marked contrast to the flowering of freedom that we saw in the late 80s and the early 90s. And it's something that should concern anyone who cares about the spread of democracy around the globe. According to Freedom House and every other human rights organization, there's been a marked pushback on human freedom in the past several years, since 2015, 2016, the rise of populist far-right parties, Trump, et cetera. And it seems like the public's willing to go along with this, right? The public is not holding governments to the promises made in the Constitution, to the fundamental pact between the citizenry and the state. And that is, I think, deeply, deeply concerning for the future of human governance, and something we need to think and study a lot more, for obvious normative reasons, but also because it's a fascinating problem in a way that the people that are being the most affected by this lack of liberty don't seem to care much for it. There seems to be a lack of appetite for freedom, yeah, so just much more work needs to be done on that. As for suggestions for the Japanese government, I think I do. I think I've thought a lot about what the Japanese government should do to, in many ways, Japanese law is relatively weak. Ono-san brought this up. In order for the Japanese government to accomplish something, they often have to rely upon citizens volunteering to do that thing. And we saw this acutely when it came to the public response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The Japanese government was, in many cases, worried about overstepping legal boundaries and trying to restrict rights in the same way that they were elsewhere. So they relied on the public to kind of quote unquote do the right thing. That means that because the Japanese government relies so much on the public, and I think there are many good things that come from this, but it means that the Japanese government needs to think a lot about public communication, right? About how they actually relay messages to citizens and to residents. And Ono-san hit upon this a little bit in his discussion comments. There are many governments around the world that have developed data science units, basically. Data labs within the government that take this issue seriously and test lots of different frames and messaging techniques to try to see which ones actually work best at getting the public to do what the government thinks is absolutely necessary to preserve freedom, safety, economic prosperity, and health. The Japanese government stands out right now as the only OECD country that does not have one of these kind of labs. And I think that is a glaring omission and something that probably should be rectified sooner rather than later. The costs of doing research on this and funding an institution that specifically looks at this sort of thing, the costs are much less than the economic gains from more effective policy pronouncements and engagement with the public would be. So I think there's a real opportunity here for the government to, I don't want to say reform, that's not quite the right word, but to advance its efforts at understanding what the public wants and how to best communicate with the public. I think that this is crucial both for domestic policy, but also for international policy. We know that public diplomacy is core to Japanese foreign policy. The Japanese government engages in this frequently. In English, actually, I see press releases all the time. I follow, Japanese government Twitter feeds and everything like that, right? All these pronouncements are meant to create, to shape public attitudes both within Japan, but also in foreign nations. And there has been, to my knowledge and understanding from the people I know at MOFA and at other ministries and agencies, there's been very little evaluation as to the effect of this messaging across Japan's borders, like beyond Japan's borders. So I think a lot more needs to be done on this. And I think it's a really exciting area where the Japanese government can realize really impactful gains with very little investment.
Thank you very much, Charles. And I think it's time for us to close now. But thank you again, Professor Crabtree, for your very insightful presentation, and you gave us some policy implication, including risk communication in the middle of the emergencies like COVID-19. Very insightful presentation. I very much appreciate your presence here, and I also like to thank Professor Ono for his comment. Thank you very much again.
Thank you very much for hosting me. Thank you to everyone at RIETI for organizing this, and thanks to everyone in the public who's joined us today. I'm really happy to have had this opportunity to share my work with you, and I would welcome any questions or comments via email about anything related to social science or this work particularly. So thanks again.
Thank you very much again, and thank you, Professor Ono.
Thank you.
So now we finished our seminar today. Thank you very much for participating. I would like to thank all the audience for participating today. Thank you very much.